Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Critical Infrastructure stage. For those of you that know Noel Ferrier, I'm not Noel. I'm David Greenfield. I'm Managing Director of Social, Environmental and Economic Solutions, a research and innovation company that is looking at circular economy and the infrastructure. I'm also the chair of the Circular Economy Club in Europe, and so I've got the pleasure of chairing an expert panel today on the topic that we're looking at, which is small changes, better places, reimagining our cities in a zero carbon world. Hopefully you're all in the right place. We're going to have a really exciting discussion, and then we're going to finish off with a bit of a panel debate as well, and questions from yourselves. So start getting your questions ready. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is ask Brenda Pooch, who's the chair of the Hackney Living Streets Group, to come and give her 10-minute presentation. Brenda, over to you.
Thanks. Okay, yeah. Hello everyone, I'm Brenda Pesh, a member of Hackney Living Streets, which is a lobby group for pedestrians. I'm here to talk about parklets. Can I ask how many of you have heard of parklets? And how many of you have actually seen a parklet? Okay, so you just got about 10%. So some of you have heard of parklets, but you may know that the idea started in California when activists created guerrilla gardens in parking bays for a few hours at a time. This was in the 1990s. Parklets are now legally permissible in the US, and there are quite a few scattered across many US cities, and also some across Europe. I'm sure that we're all aware of the sheer volume and inefficiency of space that parked cars take up on our streets. The figures are mind-boggling. Cars are not in use, on average, for 96% of the time, which is a hugely inefficient use of road space. To address this issue would take immense political will and economic disruption that is not going to happen anytime soon. Therefore, my focus as a transport activist has been on micro-interventions to challenge the dominance of private car parking on our streets. I don't know if any of you have seen these parklets in London. There are about 3 or 4 in London. They're very nice. Over the last few years, quite a few official parklets have been built across London, maybe 4 or 5. They are few and far between. The infrequency is because of the huge cost, between 50 to 80,000 pounds per parklet. And this is not going to make a dent in the dominance of parked cars on our streets. I felt it was a very top-down approach, and the way forward was a bottom-up community parklet program that would allow people to invest in their public realm in a creative way with minimal local authority input other than regulatory oversight and guidance. This would also allow parklets to be scalable. It is also a matter of equity and justice. Car owners get hugely subsidized spaces to park their private property, while non-car owners, who are the majority in inner London, have no access to this space at any price. There is no system in place to apply for a private parklet, I decided to resort to direct action to show how a parklet could be successfully created by a resident and how it could potentially transform a street. I therefore took over a parking space in front of my home, calling it a people parking bay, sign inviting people to park themselves there or to park their shopping or their bicycle there. My parklet had cost a few £100s. Within a few days, the parklet had taken the neighborhood by storm. 7 visitor books filled up. It was loved on social media and received widespread media coverage. You can see that's comments from the visitor book, and that's local people enjoying it. People used the parking bay as a resting point on their way back. Mums used it to feed their babies. Locals watered the plants. One couple had their first date there. Some people left books, and it became a mini library. I was proud of how it became a focal point where you'd see complete strangers smiling and talking to each other. It made people happy to be living in Hackney. That's some of the media coverage. After a short 3 weeks, the illegal parklet received an inevitable eviction notice for constituting a nuisance on the highway. There was universal outrage, and a petition to allow it to remain received nearly 1,000 signatures. The bay was evicted and had to be dismantled. However, due to the popularity of the bay, the council eventually launched, 1 year later, the council launched an official community parklet program in 2018. So you can see the council website. This was 1 year after they evicted my parklet. They had launched an online process where anyone in Hackney can apply for a community parklet if they don't have a car. They can apply to create a parklet in that bay. And there's the online parking process. And as you can see, well, there were 6 community parklets created in Hackney in 2 months, compared to official parklets which are built at the rate of 1 every 2 years because of the expense. So this is when I say community parklets are scalable, and you can actually have 1 on every street. That is a map of parklets in Hackney that was created by one of the parklet creators. Right, I'm just going to show you some of the parklets. The first one is a council parklet that has been taken over by a local cafe. The second one on Malvern Road is a parklet with a bird feeder and a herb garden where neighbors can come and collect herbs for their meals and chat to each other. The one on Marcon Place is a huge planter that was created by 2 women and became the focus of the first ever street party here. The parklet on Princess May Road has seating, and that's regularly used by street workers who have nowhere else to sit and have their lunch or a smoke. The thank you note on the parklet says that it gives the street a lovely, happy feeling. The last parklet, the community parklet I'm going to talk about, is a very successful one and hosts a number of community events, from knitting and walking groups to mindfulness classes. It has also been the catalyst for the community to come together and demand more substantial traffic changes on their street. This has been very successful, and Culverstone Crescent, the street on which the Culverstone Parklet was built, is going to be the first street in Hackney to benefit from a new program which is called 21st Century Streets. And as you can see, there was an article in the local paper that's announcing the start of this new program, 21st Century Streets. It reduces motor traffic and car parking and replaces it with green space and tree cover. It actually rips out the tarmac from about 4 to 6 parking spaces and replaces it with soft paving. So that's a huge step forward from having a community parklet to then being able to transform your whole street. Therefore, I do believe that the Hackney Community Parklet experiment demonstrates that facilitating parklets as part of the parking menu on our streets can be a catalyst for bringing communities together and to transform streets for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. That was really inspiring, really interesting, and we'll have a discussion about that in the panel. Our second speaker is Adrian Voice, who is the Director of Playful Planet and President of the European Network for Child-Friendly Cities. I should say Adrian, OBE. Would you like to come to the stage?
Thanks very much. It's good to be here. I should say I'm here on behalf of Playing Out. Alice Ferguson, our founding director, couldn't make it. I'm on the board, so I'm standing in for Alice today. She sends apologies. For the purpose of this talk, I'd like you to think about children as not so much a minority or a segment of the community, but the entire population at a certain age, at a certain stage in life. When you're talking about infrastructure, breaking down the population into age segments is helpful to a degree, but in terms of long-term planning, children are, all of us, just younger. And the nature of childhood is massively changing. It changed especially in the last 2 to 3 decades of the last century, and that change has continued apace in the first 2 decades of this century. It's changed in all sorts of ways, but one very key and critical way that it's changed is that children have decreasing amounts of freedom to use the outdoor world on their own with their friends and siblings. They don't play out anymore. Very rarely are children playing out in the street. We've gone from Paradise Street to shrinking childhoods. This is a slide from Natural England showing a typical family, the Thomas family, over 4 generations. The largest area there shows that a typical 8-year-old would have the freedom to roam for up to 6 miles radius from where they lived. The next generation massively decreased in the 60s or 50s and 60s to about 1 mile. And then the next generation maybe half a mile to go swimming. And then the current generation, and this was in 2007, maybe to the local shop and back, if they were lucky. Well, that was 13 years ago. I know in my street, primary school children are just not outside on their own. In fact, there's many places in the world where it's now seen as negligent parenting to allow primary school children outside on their own. This is a huge change in the way that we are growing up on planet Earth. One consequence is that children are getting their entertainment from screens, and there's a big moral panic about the use of screens. 23 hours a day on a smartphone, and that's not even counting the TV or a games console, less than they speak to their parents. Well, there's one major reason for this. We talk about paranoid parents, but the reality of road traffic is a constant and present danger for children. And even leaving aside the carnage of deaths and injuries on the roads to children and young people, there's no space for them to play outside anyway. Children know these vehicles are worth a lot of money. They're not going to go near them. Sorry, and just to note there, adults know this. 53% of adults know that traffic is the main reason that their children aren't playing outside. Now, is it paranoid to know that the roads are dangerous and children can get hurt? I don't think so. In children's own words, how do I get the... Can you hear that? Try that again. Don't worry if it's too difficult.
I'm pulling this out all the time, it's getting damaged.
So this is one 7-year-old girl.
I describe it as busy and I can't get much play because the only place I could play is my back garden. There's cars on it 24/7. I can't go anywhere. Well, I can go places, but I can't play out there. And it's hard to play. So if I want to play with my sister, I normally play indoors.
She normally plays indoors, is what she's saying. She can't play out because the roads are too busy. Well, we know from many different academic perspectives that children's play and the freedom and space in which they need to play the way that nature intends them to is vital for their pleasure and enjoyment of life now, first and foremost. That's why kids play, is because they enjoy it. But it helps them to develop emotional responses, stress responses, managing risk. They learn to be creative. They learn about attachment and they learn about place attachment. We tend to overlook children's play a little bit because it's so ubiquitous, it's so commonplace, it's so natural. And yet what children are doing when they're playing is something they can't get from the classroom, because when they're playing, they're in charge. So children are learning about self, about their own agency in their own lives, how to deal and manage and make decisions in relationships, in the physical world, in all areas of their lives. It's the area where they grow into social beings. And they need space for that. They need to be able to play freely out of doors. If we had a bit longer, I'd ask you all to do an exercise where you remembered the most fun you had as a kid. We're not going to do it because we haven't got time. But I guarantee you there were no adults around. You needed the freedom to really enjoy yourself as a child. It was when you were with your friends, with that thrill and excitement of being in charge, having to decide what you were going to do with your mates in your own time, in some special place, in nature, or maybe even on the street. Well, there is one consequence of children not having the freedom to play, and that is the obesity epidemic. There's a big focus on junk food and the availability of that to children, but the lack of exercise that children get from this constraint on their life, from the amount of restrictions placed on them having that simple freedom to run outside, is a major factor in the growing obesity epidemic. And we know that only 21% of boys and 16% of girls are getting the minimum recommended daily amount of physical activity. The quality of public space, the quality of what we call action space, that people in general and children in particular have available to them near where they live, is a major factor in the amount of time that children have playing outside. So there we go, with a massive decrease, right down to 2% of children having the opportunity to play outside unsupervised, according to the quality of the space where they live. And traffic in this is a major inhibitor. So the more the traffic, the less socializing that happens for children, the less friends they have in their street. So the less of a neighborhood they have to grow up in. I'm rattling through these slides because we don't have very long, but I hope they're making their point. The media will tend to point the finger at parents, the cotton wool culture, paranoid parenting, but there's a lot that public policy can have to do with this. The conventional response is to train children to be safe, teach them road safety. Stop, look, listen, the Green Man Code, look left, look right. Okay, all of that is good. But and by the way, if they want to play, this is where they must play. So we segment usually the most boring and denatured part of the park, and we say that's where children play. Well, our response at Playing Out has been different. We've decided that streets are not primarily roads, and we say play here. And we've set up a community interest company that shows residents, parents, other concerned residents how to allow children to play in the local street. There are now 1,130 Playing Out streets up and down the country, reaching nearly 34,000 children. It has a massive impact on family life and neighbourly life. Well, we're not just looking at temporary street closures. We commissioned this research, and there are major barriers to the ability of children to use their street as streets rather than just living alongside roads. And there are some key recommendations in this, and this is for changes in highways engineering regulations, planning guidance, to transform the streets where people live into shared space where vehicles accommodate residents rather than the other way around. And this can have a massive impact on the quality of life in the street, as we see from this illustration from Copenhagen. Do we want children to live alongside roads and play in that denatured part of the park, or do we want them to be again part of the street life? You can find out more about Playing Out here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Adrian. That's really inspiring, and takes me back to when I was a kid. Nice to see you've got Brighton in there as well. So we've talked about with Brenda talking about parking to parklets, and Adrian talking about integrating street play. And now we're going to hear from Dr. Eleanor Ratcliffe, who's going to extend the tranquil city and changing the cityscape for health and well-being. Eleanor.
Can you hear me okay? Excellent. So I'm going to give you an academic perspective. I do rather more academic than applied work, and I'm an environmental psychologist primarily. So for anyone who might not be familiar with what environmental psychology is, psychologists like me believe that people's thoughts, feelings and behaviors take place in the context of one's space and one's place, one's surroundings. And specifically I look at how our environments have an impact on the way we think and feel. How do environments impact on our well-being specifically? And I'll talk today about the concept of the tranquil city. So in my academic work, I've been collaborating with an organisation called Tranquil City, which they seek to change how people engage with the urban environment around them, particularly in London. And actually when I was preparing this talk, I was thinking about the title, because it says Changing the City Soundscape. And actually I'm going to challenge that a bit, because I want to understand how we can change the way we engage with the city soundscape, rather than changing what we're hearing specifically. But I keep the emphasis on health and well-being. And a lot of my work in terms of environmental psychology is about people's relationships with nature. And there's a lot of evidence that's been built up over the last 30, even 40 years, which suggests that spending time in or with nature can affect people's health and well-being. So this is a screen grab from a paper that was recently published by some friends and colleagues of ours at Surrey, and they do research at the University of Exeter and the University of Plymouth. So Matt White and his colleagues have analysed large-scale data, so looking at people's feelings of subjective well-being, how much they report they're in good health, for example, and they related that to how much time people spend in nature. And they found that if people spend at least 2 hours a week engaging with nature, they tend to report better self-reported health and well-being. But crucially, that doesn't have to be just in one block, so people can have little visits to nature and accrue those over time throughout the week, and they get the same kind of benefits. So it seems that you can have little snippets of nature in, for example, parklets like we've heard, and that can contribute to people's well-being. So I'm very interested in how we can fit these experiences of nature into the urban environment and not just tell people they have to go for a hike in the wilderness or something like that. How can we make engagement with nature more accessible to people in urban spaces? And the topic that I did my PhD on is specifically to do with how nature can help people to restore themselves psychologically. We call this restorative environments theory or research. So we know that spending time in or with nature can help people to recover from everyday stress and strain and fatigue. So for example, if they've had a stressful week at work, or if they've been spending time on a fatiguing work task, spending time with nature can help them build up the resources they need to cope with those stresses or replenish the resources they need to focus. And there's a number of nice literature reviews in this area now. So a good colleague of ours, Terry Hartig in Uppsala in Sweden, his review from 6 years ago now suggests that there's a lot of evidence to do with improved mood when you spend time with nature, recovering from negative mood and increased stress through engaging with nature. Also, people's recovery of cognitive performance. So very often this is lab-based tests where we get people stressed and tired and then put them in front of a computer to do attention tasks. But that kind of evidence suggests that even viewing pictures or films of nature can help people to recover the attention they need to continue with those kinds of tasks. And there is also increasing evidence on broader impacts, so people feeling more creative, more inspired when they take the time to go out into nature. And also that they might behave in a more pro-social way. They might be more helpful and kind to those around them and less aggressive if they have nature present in their environment. And so there's some pictures on the right-hand side there, which you can see, and this is from a paper by some Australian colleagues, and they looked at actually people's micro breaks during the workday and how they might attend better to work-type tasks if they had a green roof available to them. So they compared how people performed cognitively when they were looking at a green roof versus a grey concrete roof, and they found that people performed better on attention tasks. And that was even just in a very small time span, so 40 seconds. So even you don't even have to get out into nature for a long period of time for it to have a measurable effect on the way you think and feel. And a lot of this research is a little bit challenging to me because it focuses so much on the visual experience. I think that really locks out people who might engage with nature through different kinds of senses. So for example, the blind and visually impaired, or even people who just don't have access to large areas of green space, but you can still engage with nature in other ways. So the topic of my PhD a few years ago, and I've continued to do work in this area since, is looking at how people engage with sounds of nature, particularly the sounds of birds or of water or of rustling leaves. And for a number of years I've been collaborating with the National Trust, and just recently they released some interesting findings that I was able to comment on. They asked people to listen to woodland sounds, and they compared that to more traditional kind of mindfulness and meditation exercises. And they found that people responded more positively to the sounds of nature, and they felt more relaxed and more calm when they listened to those sounds, as opposed to having to try to do some other kind of relaxation activity. So this makes me really happy to see more of this kind of research being engaged and acted upon. In an academic sense, we also test this in the laboratory by getting people to listen to different types of sounds. So this is a study by some Swedish researchers from 10 years ago. They asked people to listen to the sounds of birdsong and water versus noise from the built environment, kind of industrial sounds and traffic, and then low, minimal kind of everyday noises from a room, for example. And before they got people to listen to these sounds, they made them really stressed by getting them to do all kinds of nasty tasks like impossible mental arithmetic, and there were buzzers and bells going off. So people were not in a very good mood by the time they had to listen to these sounds. But the researchers found that when people listened to the sounds of nature, so birds and water, their physiological stress, their heart rate, their skin conductance, it fell more quickly. They recovered physiologically faster when they listened to the sounds of nature as opposed to sounds from the built environment. So that's a very nice academic finding that supports the point I'm trying to make. But in saying these kinds of things, I don't want to demonize the sounds of the city or the built environment. I think they have a lot that they can give us. So researchers now are starting to look at whether urban environments can generate some of the same benefits that nature can. And they find, for example, in a quote from this paper from 2018, certain urban locations, including cafes, museums, cultural places, and even some residential streets, have a high potential to help people to recover psychologically and restore themselves. And from my perspective as an academic, I think that's a lot to do with people's attachment to place. If you have positive memories, positive associations, that can really help people to feel like they're being comforted and supported. But also there are many pleasant sounds in these places. The sounds of people chatting, maybe the sound of the coffee being made as you're in your favorite cafe, the sound of children playing in streets as we've just heard. So I think we have to be careful not to say that all built environments are bad and all natural environments are good. How can we take advantage of the good things that we can see and hear in the city around us? And at the start of the talk, I mentioned I've been working with this group, Tranquil City. So first of all, they started by encouraging people to crowdsource and share online places in London in particular that they found tranquil and restorative. And so they highlighted lots of pocket parks and parklets, places by the river, larger public parks as well that they found tranquil and where they would go if they wanted to relax and restore themselves. And that was a first step. And lately what I've been helping Tranquil City do is integrate academic evidence with this kind of crowdsourced data to form an index of urban tranquility. So this is a first version of the index they've been developing. And this integrates information on noise pollution, air pollution, and also areas of water and green space to highlight parts of London, for example, so the more green areas that you see, yes, there is more green space there. There's also reduced levels of air pollution, reduced levels of noise pollution. And the aim of this index is to try and get people to use it to change the way they engage with the urban environment. Can they redesign the route they might take to work or between two places they want to get to in some other kind of context? And maybe it will be a less direct route, but it's one that exposes them to more restorative, more pleasant and more relaxing aspects of the urban environment. So this is an index that's still in development, but hopefully it will be taken up by more and more people and also apps and other applied contexts as well. So if you want to hear more about this, I'm happy to answer questions later. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Eleanor. Fascinating research and really exciting to see the Tranquility Index. Looking forward to seeing further information on that. So, our fourth speaker is Jim Smith, the Urban Forestry Advisor from the Forestry Commission, who's going to talk to us about how we could add canopy cover and the urban forest. Jim, over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, move straight off. Yeah. Did you give me an update? No, that's fine. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I'm Jim Smith. I'm Forestry Commission's Urban Forestry Advisor. And I'm just here to talk to you a little bit about how we can increase canopy cover and improve the urban forest in towns and cities across the UK. Essentially, in urban areas worldwide, tree planting and tree retention is almost always dictated by human development, whether that be existing development or proposed development. Go to the tallest building in any city, look out across the city, and you'll see that, in my view, the single largest element of green infrastructure that you'll be able to see are the trees and woodlands. And in my world, they're probably one of the most important elements of green infrastructure and contribute the most citywide because they cover all the different land use categories bar open water. And one of the things that I'll be pushing today in terms of green infrastructure is that they should be, trees and woodlands in the urban context should be considered to be critical infrastructure along with transport, utilities and the built environment. So there was a report produced in 2013 to support the coalition government's Big Tree Plant, which was their coalition government's tree planting grant, and it was called the Barriers and Drivers to Tree Planting and Retention in Urban Areas. And Barrier B, as was mentioned earlier, was local highway authority policy and PFI contracts in relation to adopted highways. So predicating against the planting of trees or predicating against the presence of very large landscape trees, which we know and which the Trees and Design Action Group know are some of the best trees to improve our health and well-being in urban areas. Barrier G, as was mentioned earlier, was car parking provision in existing streets and new developments. So actually providing new trees or actually removing trees to either put a car parking space on the street itself or to create a run-in onto someone's front garden so that they could park a car there. So those two barriers were highlighted as being some of the top barriers to getting trees into urban areas. So a lack of integrated planning process. So trees should be considered at the earliest stages of planning process, at the master planning stage. And what we get at the moment is little blobs on maps, but that bears no relation to the actual physical, practical needs to get those trees in the ground and to make sure that they're catered for physiologically. Poorly specified PFI contracts, and recently the case in Sheffield, if you're familiar with that, has really highlighted the problems with those contracts. Perceptions of damage, whether that be direct damage by the tree roots or the trunk of the tree causing physical damage to adjacent urban infrastructure, or indirect damage where tree roots may cause subsidence to local building foundations adjacent to the tree. Conflict with utilities, so provision of utilities in highways, that sort of thing. And conflict, as we discussed earlier, conflict with highway provision. And also, I like to add the last one, misinformation, or what we might term fake news in today's parlance, but more about that later. So the Trees and Design Action Group, whose stand is just over there, have produced a guide called Trees in Hard Landscapes, a guide for delivery. And they worked closely with the Chartered Institute for Highways and Transportation and the Institute for Civil Engineers on producing that. So there's some really good advice there. So I really would point you in the direction of that document if you can get a hold of one. So the biggest issue for tree planting on new and existing highways is the future growth of the tree. So catering for its presence. And that's because cities are artificial creations, but often we forget that trees are living, breathing organisms that require the same basic needs as humans to thrive. And I think the previous presentations have articulated that really well. Trees need space, water, air, light and nutrients to thrive. But unlike buildings, roads and urban infrastructure, they do not remain static. They grow, they change their state, their needs and requirements alter over time, just like people. So a document was produced by CLG, the Communities and Local Government Department, in 2008, I think it was, Trees in Towns 2, and that showed us, that demonstrated that we were changing the nature of the urban forest. Larger landscape trees were being sort of very gradually removed from the landscape and planted more sort of ornamental, smaller ornamentals, trees with less canopy cover were planted. And this process is still going on today. But it can be done. You can actually integrate trees, significant trees of scale, into the urban landscape. This is Frankfurt in Germany, where they've actually done some really excellent work in integrating car parking bays on a chevron sort of like design with some very large existing chestnut trees. Similarly, in the south of France, this is Nice, central reservation planting. And my angle on this is that in the future, we're going to need to be planting trees that are resilient for future climate change scenarios. And it's no stretch of the imagination to think that this might what Brighton might look like in the future. This is central reservation planting in Holloway Road. It was done in the mid-1990s, and it's been very successful, but a tremendous amount of pressure from the Highway Authority not to do that. It took, I actually, when I was working at London Borough of Islington, got this in with colleagues, and it took us about 3 years of work to get that agreed. But it can be done. This is a photograph from the 1950s London Development Plan. That was the development plan for the Abercrombie plan for the reconstruction of London after the Second World War. And if you look closely, they've rather than removing that tree or doing anything to the tree, they've built that small dwarf wall around the tree. And that's that tree as it is today. Similarly, local authorities can make choices about losing a car parking space and allowing a curbside build out. If the tree is significant enough, they can do that very simply. This is just outside my house, actually. If you look closely next to where the yellow lines are, there's a small yellow circle. the local authority were actually decided to upgrade their lamp columns. They were removing all the old lamp columns and putting new ones in. And I went out there one day, saw this guy drawing a yellow circle on the ground. It was right next door to that tree, which is a tree I paid for and have been looking after ever since. And all I said, well, if you put that lamp column where you are, you're going to create problems for the future. Could you just move it along a bit? And without really questioning me, he did. He moved it another metre further away from that tree, and it was easy peasy. That sort of thing is very simple to implement if you think about it beforehand. But regrettably, that's the next street along. The guy didn't take, either he might have done that before he talked to me, but my point is that local highway authorities, particularly highway engineers and street lighting officials, they have programs, computer programs, that disregard the presence of trees. They don't even have the presence of street trees on there. And what we need to do is have some better joined up thinking between local authority departments and central government too. I'm not letting central government off the hook, so that decisions about where you put that sort of infrastructure are integrated into where the green infrastructure is as well. So local authority tree and woodland frameworks and strategies, and we're now calling them frameworks, should be embedded in policies, in local authority policies, with cross-departmental consensus on implementation. And if I had a wish list on the strategic objectives, cars making way for trees, I'd suggest that the urban forest should be perceived and strategically managed as a single resource, covering the whole of an urban area, including its highway and car parking provision. And a tree and woodland strategy or framework should be co-created and endorsed by the local highway authority, as has been mentioned earlier. Coupled with that, central government should take a lead on having a new revision of Manual for Streets 2, a document produced with support from the Department of Transport by the Chartered Institute for Highways and Transportation, and that should detail the possible engineering solutions to accommodate trees. And those engineering solutions were ones that the Forestry Commission highlighted in its report into Sheffield, into the unlicensed felling of trees in Sheffield. So it can be done. You can have much more flexible pit sizes around pre-existing trees. You can use different materials. This is a rubber crumb, a type of rubber crumb that's put over, can extend tree pit sizes around tree and still be an effective walkable surface. And this one has a dual purpose of creating an informal suds area, because that area allows rainwater to percolate down into the root plate of the tree. Central reservation again, talking about this we had to go through a 3-year process of doing a safety audit to get that in place. And it took an awful long time to persuade the highways officials to do that, but it is achievable. You can do it, and I think it's going to be easier now. That was done nearly 2 decades ago. It's going to be easier now because of the issue of climate change emergencies. Cabinet members and councillors will be more receptive to that type of approach. This is a photograph, again taken from the London Development Plan in 1950, and it's probably, I think it was taken about 1948. Those trees were planted in Kingsway, central London, in 1948. And that's them now. But the reason I use that shot in my presentations is the difference in time between that shot and this shot is about 60 years, or about the same length of time that we have between now and the worst impacts of climate change scenarios that are likely to be coming forward in the future. Although recent research is indicating that time frame is diminishing, and it's probably closer to 40 to 50 years. Now, the reason I use this slide is many of you who are old enough in the audience will know that this is Ronald Reagan. He was known as the great communicator, but he was also known for being a purveyor of misinformation and fake news. And one of his quotes was, trees cause more pollution than automobiles. And I was at school when this happened. I just couldn't believe it. So I think you need to challenge that. When you hear that information, you need to challenge it. It's to do with car exhaust. It's the cars that cause the pollution, not trees. So, but one other quote that he did make, which I agree with, was that, and I'm going to paraphrase, he did say that there's nothing as good for the inside of a man as the outside of a horse. So I'm going to paraphrase that and say there's nothing as good for the inside of a person as the outside of a tree. So if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this talk today, would be we should treat trees and woodlands as well, urban woodlands, as critical infrastructure on a par with built environment infrastructure like utilities, transport and built environment. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jim. I agree with you entirely on everything to do with trees. Really something we need to take more on board. Our final contributor for this afternoon is Catherine Lariva, who's the associate at FCB Studios, and she's going to be talking about opportunities for housing. Catherine, would you like to come up?
Hello.
Oh, sorry. Hello, I'm Catherine Lariva. I'm an urban designer at Field and Clegg Bradley. I'm going to talk about opportunities for housing. And unfortunately, this is finding a great fixer-upper that provides a lot of opportunity to realize your vision and put in a bit of elbow grease are few and far between these days. And we're faced with a housing crisis, which means people are renting for longer. Young people are forced to move back into the home, causing stress on the family, and really impacting people's mental lives. And overcrowding is at a high, and the homeless population is at a peak as well. And it's obvious when you walk around London that something needs to be done. Now, developers are building houses as fast as they can, as long as they can make their profits at the current prices. And a lot of the houses that are under the £500,000 mark are being sold overseas. So the affordable housing isn't really going to the Londoners who really need it. And council estates, which used to be the affordable option for people that needed to live in London, have been regenerated in a way that reduces the amount of affordable housing. And a lot of research has been done and adjustments have been made, but they're just not delivering the homes that people need. And the radical regeneration also has reduced the amount of mature trees that were there, and also got rid of the embodied carbon that was actually in those estates to begin with. And as someone who lives on a housing estate, I prefer a more community-led, bottom-up approach than a top-down approach. And architects for social housing have developed plans with communities that show how this could be done, how we could look at micro-development and community-led interventions to create a more harmonious regeneration and an addition of homes that work with the communities that live there and don't displace those communities. And I can look around my own estate in South London and see opportunities for rooftop extensions, to extend existing buildings, to reconfigure bin stores and parking areas, to provide homes for people, or extend the existing homes that are there to reduce overcrowding. So we see this site, it actually, if you look at the picture in the bottom, you can see people actually see it as just a bit of green concrete and often will park there and they don't really use the space. And you could actually keep the trees there and build 4 homes and put restrictions on the type of development to show how homes could actually increase the biodiversity there, provide homes, and set a new exemplar for sustainable housing. And this is a space behind my property that for years we looked out onto and thought something could be done with this. We could extend our property. So I pestered the council. I went to community meetings and I talked to the local authority. And after 12 years, I did manage to get the bit of land, and I made a 1-bedroom flat into a 2-bedroom property with a small garden. And it just only took 12 years, a lot of red tape and a lot of my time and a lot of investment. But it happened and it really had a positive impact. And you can see there's a lot of thought out there about how we can reimagine our roof spaces. This is a scheme in North London, which takes an existing building and adds another 2 floors. And our Field and Clegg Bradley also did a bit of work to see how the outer suburbs could reappropriate parking spaces to little micro homes. And I think when it all comes down to it, when people create tailored interventions that work with the existing community, you can get really innovative, inspiring architecture and something that reflects a city full with creative and innovative people that actually serves them and creates something to be proud of. So how can we enable community-led development and provide an alternative from this top-down approach? Well, a couple years ago for the NLA, we submitted an idea for creating an app, because it was 5 years ago and apps were cool. And it was a way of getting a lot of people on board and participating on how you can rethink space. So we thought if you created an app and then started to identify opportunities that people see in their neighborhoods where you could maybe add housing, you could start a conversation and maybe flag out the sites that might be ready for small interventions. And then you can start the dialogue. You can get people from individuals to cooperative housing groups to the local authority to start to reimagine these sites. You could also then overlay data such as crime, antisocial behaviors, and figure out where there's community support for new housing. And with that, you could identify an intensification zone. Now we have conservation areas, so why not have intensification areas that outline a framework for how you could envision new housing? And you could set standards for sustainability, for how you would incorporate habitat and biodiversity, and how the interventions will improve the existing community and retain the people that retain the communities that live there and work together. And with these intensification areas, you could create a larger network within the boroughs or within London to provide support from professionals and people that are leaders in the industry to really give them that leg up and help reduce the red tape that I had to go through when I spent the 12 years trying to do what I wanted to do. And also, there's a lot of new ways that we could support building, whether it be dropping an extension on top of a building or developing an ideal home factory, or just how housing associations or local authorities can use the best methods to deliver sustainable housing. And Field and Clegg Bradley worked with Arab a couple years ago to kind of look at how you could take that idea of creating a module that could be developed to work in taking car parking spaces and retrofitting them with housing. And this was the kit of parts that you could kind of imagine using to reinvent a space. And so here we use that kit of parts to take 4 car parking spaces in creating a 2-bedroom house. Now it's just an idea, obviously, at the moment, but I think it's something that we need to explore if we really want to provide an alternative from the top-down development. And I think by identifying underutilized land and seeing opportunities, whether it be space for car parking or underutilized space, we can start to stimulate a groundswell of people changing and delivering housing for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Can I ask all the speakers to come back up to the stage, and we'll have some panels discussion. Hopefully you found that really interesting. It's been really inspiring to see some of the opportunities as well as some of the challenges. And I will let you all sit there. I'm going to stand here and ask you, firstly, one of the questions that wasn't really raised in any of your presentations was actually carbon, and how in some of the solutions is that being embraced. Catherine, I'm going to start with you. Just in terms of carbon and how we actually reduce carbon in some of these solutions, how are we measuring it and how are we able to deliver solutions that the decision makers can really understand in terms of what carbon is and how your solutions will help support zero carbon?
Well, do I need a pressing thing? I think we need to recognize how much effort is when you have to take apart a building and where all that material goes. And I think we need to value carbon in a way when we are doing building projects as a line item. So developers and local authorities can see that you're actually all that embodied carbon does have value. And I think the retrofit first campaign that's been going on for the last year or so is starting to recognize that you can take buildings and reuse them.
Yeah, I think that's really important. If anybody is looking at decision making around old buildings and whether to take them down, the best thing to do from a carbon perspective is don't, and see if you can reuse them. Ruth, I don't know if you want to add sorry, Brenda, do you want to add to that?
Is that working? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, private car use, car transport contributes 15% of carbon emissions. I think that's the figure. So anything that tackles that, so whether it addresses parking of cars, which makes it easier to drive cars. If you have free parking, it's easier to drive and own a car and use a car, rather than share a car and have a car club or use a taxi or use public transport. So anything that tackles that subsidy to cars in the form of parking, or just tackling that very, very inefficient use of street space where cars are just parked there and don't allow children to play or don't allow a tree to be planted there. Anything that tackles that reduces carbon use because it reduces car use, and that has to be a good thing.
Eleanor, is there a role for carbon in soundscape?
That's a very interesting question. My answer would relate actually to active travel. So one of the reasons the work I've been doing with Tranquil City is relevant to carbon is because we're encouraging people to explore areas of the urban environment through walking or cycling, and inevitably that has an impact on carbon emissions. But it's about using those active methods of travel, I think, to find areas of the urban environment that you would not otherwise go to. So passing through green space, passing through areas of reduced noise pollution or reduced air pollution. So it's about the way in which you're exploring the city.
Jim, this should be a relatively easy one for you. Trees and carbon.
Trees, obviously, they lock up carbon, and obviously in large-scale plantings, that's really helpful. In the urban context, they contribute to that, but they don't actually add. I think the figures I've seen are relatively small, in the low single figures, in terms of how much carbon can be locked up. But certainly iTree studies of London, Manchester and other places around the country show that there is a role for those. I would look at it in a different way. If you're talking about new construction, one of the issues that I've come across in my as a planning tree officer is that trees are obviously, as I mentioned, weeded out of master plans because their relationship with the tree and causing problems with building foundations can be quite critical, but particularly in areas where there's clay soils, and that's a significant part of the country. One beneficial aspect of this and a win-win situation would be, we're talking with people like the NHBC, National House Building Council, and colleagues in other government departments about using engineered design foundations that use less carbon, rather than just digging a big trench, filling it with concrete and then building on that, and then not being able to plant any trees near that. Doing a pile and beam solution or another engineered foundation uses less concrete, and it permits you to plant street trees and trees in people's front and back gardens as well, as long as it's thought about at the very earliest stages.
Brilliant. And then Adrian, carbon and playing out in the streets and other activities.
Well, there's a big relationship between a playable space in a neighbourhood and a pedestrian-friendly space. A good area for street play is a good area for children to have independent mobility, active travel, walking to school. But also in the wider context, if we want a generation growing up in a way that lowers the carbon footprint, we need children to be able to become more independently mobile, to be accustomed to walking to places, to getting around on public transport. And at the moment, the other relationship, apart from it inhibiting their playing out with their friends, the way that previous generations used to do, the other major relationship that today's children have with vehicles is that's how they get around, because their parents are ferrying them all over the place, because the outdoor world is seen as too hostile for them, ironically, because of the vehicles they're in. So it's a lose-lose situation. If we just create more shared streetscapes that allow children outside, create more pedestrian zones, we'll have children growing up again with less reliance on motorised transport.
I think that behaviour change aspect is so critical. We can explore that, or if you've got questions, put your hands up. We will explore that because I've got a question there. But just, can we touch upon behaviour change? Because I think we'll come to your question in a second, sir. Behaviour change, some of the solutions that you proposed are actually relatively simple solutions. But as you mentioned, Catherine, taking 12 years to put in a particularly small development, there is a huge amount of opposition to some of the sensible solutions for many, many reasons. How do we actually challenge and get around some of those? Who wants to pick that? Eleanor, I'll ask you to pick it up first.
Well, from the context of health and well-being, I think a lot of it is about communicating to people the impacts that the environment can have on their health and well-being. And a lot of the time it's about physical health when you do see that messaging. But for me, it's really important to convey to people that if you engage more with cleaner, greener environments, it can be very good for your mental health. And I think with sort of mental health awareness events and days and that kind of thing, it becomes easier. But one thing I'm trying to do now is working to, for example, engage apps to do with routing and wayfinding in the city with this kind of Tranquil City Index. So not only are you looking for the most time efficient or direct route through an urban environment, but also an environment that might help you to feel better.
I'm very interested. Adrian, do you want to?
We come across quite a lot of opposition to, you can imagine, when we close a street for the day, residents have to be escorted with their vehicles. We don't ban them completely, we can't do that, but they have to be escorted. Families that don't have children find that quite an imposition. But over time, what we find is that by listening and not trying to impose things, not bulldozering through, but trying to create a whole community consultation process, people can be persuaded to come along. And I think a couple of other speakers have made the point that the neighborhood environment has some common qualities. It's good for trees, good for children, good for people. Building that kind of sense of ownership of place from the street upwards is a very powerful way to go, and we all have more in common than we have differences in any local community, and we all need a sort of natural, livable environment.
Brenda, I know that some of the parklet schemes, some residents have complained in the past about lack of parking. How has that been approached, and have you got any experience of that from the centre of London?
In terms of complaints from people who do have cars?
Yes.
Saying, yeah. Well, in the inner city, in fact, the number of people who don't have cars are double the number of those that do. So it's only 30% of households that do own cars. So the majority don't. But 100% of the street space is taken over by car owners. Because if someone doesn't have a car, you can park 2 cars. If a third person doesn't have a car, you can buy 3 cars and park them. But I think people do appreciate that even those with cars parking numerous cars on the street, that there is an advantage to having a community space on a street, so long as there aren't too many of them, don't take up too many parking spaces. I think it would become a threat if they started having to pay the true cost for their parking space, or if they were only allowed to park 1 car on the street. But so far, it's actually been very popular, even amongst the car owners. And the comments are, I own a car, but I still love having 1 space on the street where I can sit down. So to that extent, yes, it does generate community spirit, and people do love having something like that. Some nice green, a little green mini park on the street.
We'll come to the other speakers in a minute. I'd like to take the question that you prepared, sir.
Yes, my name's Robin Darton. I work at
Just hold it a bit closer.
My name's Robin Darton. I work at the University of Kent. Your focus has been on the private car, but I was very struck by a very recent report about the growth in non-private vehicles, particularly in London. White vans delivering, home delivery stuff, and Uber taxis and so on circling around trying to get a fare. So I think it's important not to just focus on the private car, but the entire transport arrangements for all people's requirements.
Who wants to pick that one up? For some of you didn't hear, essentially the role of Uber and the rise in white van, man and woman.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, just to say that is a significant problem. And I think, again, it's subsidizing because they're allowed to drive for free, park for free. It's subsidizing people who expect cheap or free delivery. And really, there should be a tax on deliveries. Every time you get a takeaway delivered, you should have to pay £1 or 50p. And then people would rather walk the mile to get the delivery. And if it's a big item and you have to have it delivered, you can't walk, then you should still have to pay for it. And I think that would considerably reduce the amount of deliveries if you ask people to pay for the use of that car on the street through road user charging or through curbside use. So you park on the curb, you pay for it. So I think economic ways you can reduce those amount of deliveries. But in fact, what would help is the last mile delivery, which I'm sure you've heard of. Last mile delivery hubs, where you have delivery hubs in local shops, post offices, even in the council. And in fact, one of the proposed uses for parklets was to have a hub, like a locker system, on a parklet on the street. So you just walk down to the bottom of a street to pick up a delivery item. So I think you've made a very, very valid and good point, and it does need to be tackled really firmly and robustly.
I think there's some really interesting additions to that. We're seeing in places like Brighton that we're getting cargo bike schemes in place. So actually the last mile is done by somebody on a bike with a really big pannier. Eleanor, just in terms of soundscape again, I love what you're doing on the soundscape, so apologies for asking lots of questions. In terms of that, might we see in the future the soundscape of drones delivering parcels?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. It sounds very futuristic, you know.
I don't think it's that futuristic.
The future is now.
Yeah.
Well, something that it brings to mind is electric vehicles. I can't speak directly to drones, but because electric vehicles come with their own issues, you know, people need some kind of sound to be alerted that, for example, a large vehicle like a hybrid or electric bus is arriving. I'm aware that TfL are doing some consultation on what the sound of these electric buses, for example, should be. And then it really forces us to think, you know, what is the sound of the city that we want to generate? Would it be strange and unsettling for people to have a city where there was the sound of no cars? What would we choose to replace it? And some of the ideas that have been mooted are rather strange. You know, I don't think we should have the sound of bells and whistles coming out of electric vehicles. But it certainly, I think, requires an interdisciplinary approach. So acoustics experts, psychologists, behavioral scientists, to understand whether the sounds we want to artificially put on quieter vehicles are the kinds that make people pay attention and behave in an appropriate way. So that's not really about drones, I'm sorry. But
No, it's fine. So having a bus with a Ferrari engine noise is not going to happen. We've got a question over there.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ian Phillips. I'm a landscape architect and town planner. There are two methods or mechanisms I've used in the past for taming streets, particularly in residential streets, and particularly with new developments. One is to not have the street adopted by the Public Highway Authority, but for it to be adopted by the residents, so that the residents have ownership of the street and their kids can use it, their cars can use it, their trees can be planted in it, and they'll need to pay some upkeep, but they can also choose the surfacing treatment. I actually live in an unadopted road myself, and it works very well on a communal basis. Each of 40 properties pay about £50 a year for upkeep, fill in the potholes, and it's automatically traffic calmed and it's automatically a play street, as well as it being a space where neighbours can congregate and meet in a shared surface. The other mechanism is, and it gets around all the highway design guidance which highway authorities insist on, and the sea of tarmac. The other mechanism is to actually designate streets as open space and then allow vehicle access over them. And I was involved in a development once where a village square effectively was designated as open space, which meant that it could easily be closed to traffic to allow events to take place. And again, for it to become part of a community facility rather than having to go through road closure orders. But the rest of the time it was functioned as a car park. So there are mechanisms which can be applied through the planning system at the time of giving permission for new developments that can start changing the way we view streets.
Catherine, do you want to comment on that? Looking.
Yeah, I think seeing streets as a piece of open space is a very good starting point. And I've done a lot of work on schemes trying to get people to think differently about it. And typically it's depending on who's on your team to get that changed. I think back to the presentation of working with local authorities, it's finding people with the vision that are going to push things through to transform an existing space into something new. Because I think a lot of things are designed for an era, it's designed with this vision from the 60s or 70s or the 80s. But places need to change, and it's how we can enable places to change, streets to change, parking spaces to be reallocated into parklets to address the modern needs of today. And how do we create that climate for people to really push forward change for now, or the future?
Jim, I'm just wondering from your perspective, with a lot of the new developments, are you managing to get trees in them, and the right kinds of trees, or is it something that is still not really part of the deal moving forward?
I think the short answer to that is no. On the big regeneration projects where you've got significant budgets available for landscaping, then it works, and those trees are integrated. But my focus is on the volume house builder, where you've got, there's a need obviously, and no one questions the need for an awful lot of house building in this country at the moment. But if we're not careful, we're going to be creating estates or areas where people live where there are no significant trees, no significant shade, none of the benefits that you get with that, none of the sounds that go with that or the smells that go with that. So it could be a problem in the future. So yeah, that's one of the things that we're working to resolve at the minute.
I don't know, you look at
One thing I want to add also is that people form attachment to specific trees, and I think that's something we have to think about. So I don't know if anyone looked at The Guardian today, but there was a very nice piece on readers submitting their memories and attachments to favourite trees. So maybe a little off topic, but I would encourage people to have a look at that.
Brenda, do you want to...
I think it's a lovely idea for people to adopt their streets, and I'm glad it's worked for some developments. I know my experience in Hackney is that as soon as you get a community, like a local neighborhood planning, the conversation is, okay, let's make all parking free, and let's ban cyclists, and let's just put gates on our streets, and let's stop pedestrians as well, and let's make it just parking and free parking. That's my experience. I'm glad your experience has been more positive, but that's the experience in Hackney for any group that wants to adopt their street. So I think the pros and cons. For me personally, I prefer an impartial arbiter like a local authority that has the greater good in mind, and I prefer to leave the decision making to them than to a group of people who have strong personal interests in maintaining the system as it is. So that it depends, I think, from place to place and from community to community.
Adrian, have you tried to adopt a road for play schemes? Or is it something that we should look at?
No, I haven't looked into adopting a street. I mean, what we do is we get temporary street closure orders for a period of time on a weekly or fortnightly basis, but that is only a temporary solution by definition. And what we're campaigning for in the longer term is for changes in highways, engineering, streetscape guidance from the Department for Transport, for local authorities to be more proactive in creating properly residential zones. And ultimately what we have to do, and we need political will for this, I completely agree. It has to be local authority, but it has to be also national government. There needs to be political commitment to recognise that in residential areas, it's not appropriate for vehicles to have right of way. We've got this one-dimensional view of streets, which is really that they're roads first and foremost, and everything has to work around that. And as long as we're always accommodating the vehicle, whether private or public, it makes no difference to a child what the provenance of the vehicle is. It's not appropriate for that amount of public space to be dominated by quite a narrow commercial interest, which is what it is, an economic interest. It's about, if we want livable streets, then people have to have right of way. Like the Woonerf in Holland, the original Woonerf is 5 miles per hour, or 5 kilometers per hour maximum, and vehicles give right of way to pedestrians. It totally transforms the neighborhood. We tried it here, but we didn't go far enough. 20 miles per hour, children will still get seriously hurt. The street is still not a place where they can play. It just reduces the fatalities. We've got to go much further and be much bolder, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We have got time for a very, very, very quick question, and then we're going to have to stop. So I don't know where the microphone's going. Thank you. So if you could just, a very quick question, that'd be lovely. And if it's directed at somebody, please let them know.
Question for Adrian. Pavement design hasn't changed in, I don't know, well, I'm 40, but in 40 years. And it's just standard concrete paving slabs, which they get replaced quite frequently, and within a couple of years they already start to move, and then children trip over, or if you have difficulties walking, then you trip over. And what do you think the barriers are to changing and improving pavement design, because it's not really designed for pedestrians or children?
Well, the excuse that's given usually is cost, and that's not really an excuse. It's a fact of life that retrofitting highways infrastructure is extremely costly, capital-wise. And there was a Home Zones challenge a few years ago that didn't really lead to the widespread uptake of the innovations that were made, and cost was the major factor. But that was 20, 30, 40 years ago, and what we need to see is current guidance that looks at shared space, different surfaces, but ultimately it's that political will to reconceptualize what we mean by a street where people live. Do we want to live alongside roads, or do we want to live in streets? And once you've made that conceptual commitment to creating livable streets, everything else is possible. And you have to make that decision first, I think, because then all sorts of surfaces are available. You get rid of the signage and the lineage that tells the driver it's a street, and they slow down because they know that the onus is on them, not on us, to keep out of their way.
Thank you, Adrian. One very, very, very quick question.
Okay, it wasn't actually a question, it was a comment, and that was about street ownership. I actually try to own my road. I've done street parties. I converted it to 20 miles an hour a few years ago. And I don't think that it is for the local authority to own all the streets, because they hamper the process. We living there are better aware of what would better suit us. By taking ownership of our road, what we're actually doing is encouraging open dialogue. I speak to everybody on my road. It's a very long road. It's not a small one. You've got to put a lot of commitment and effort into it. But if you give ownership to the local authority, they don't necessarily have your best interest at heart. You're absolutely right. Why is the road allowed for vehicles where I have to stop and wait for a barrage of vehicles to go past when I should be able to cross on my road? And I think we need to do more about that kind of living, where we have total, we're unified in some way and we belong somewhere, rather than just let passerbys who drive a car through a rat run to get past.
Thank you very much for that comment. I'm not going to ask you to comment on that, mainly because we're out of time, but I think it's a very well-made comment, and something for us all to go away and think about. How can we actually embrace everything that you've been discussing on the panel, And as a thank you, rather than clapping, and just because this is something I learned from Oxford University a few months ago, rather than clapping, if you could do jazz hands, just in regards to people who don't actually like the sound of clapping. So jazz hands is a thank you to the panel.